after being bounced in the play-in tournament with the impending free agency of potentially Fred VanVleet, potentially Gary Trent Jr., and Jakob Poeltl, what do you see fit as the plan for the Toronto Raptors in this upcoming offseason?
I've been a proponent for a long time. By a long time, probably like half a season. So nothing egregious, but it's time for the rebuild. Looking at just where this team has been, there's a clear ceiling in place. You just don't have a guy that is really going to get to that superstar level and be that number one in a contending team on this roster. But you do have a lot of solid pieces where if you keep a Scotty and maybe like one other guy, at least for now, and get rid of some of the others for some future assets, you could really build back even better because there's still a lot of talent on this roster. So they can go from where they're at now and just making a few trades can really set themselves up to be good in, I don't know, 2-3 years. I don't even think it'd have to be like a long-term tankathon because we know the Raptors front office isn't too big on, oh, let's just be terrible. I think they could get to a point where it's like, hey, we still have some quality players, but we might hover around like a 12, 13 seed just because of how competitive the entire league is, but especially the Eastern Conference recently. I feel like they have a lot of flexibility in terms of mock-ups that you've seen for Pascal or OG or anybody else on the roster. A lot of opportunities there. It just kind of depends on whether or not they can commit to it because we've seen for years now they really don't like to make big changes. The one really big one was making that Kawhi trade and making that final push. And even that took probably the most embarrassing sweep in franchise history. So I don't know how motivated they're going to be to really do anything major just because of the fact of they can say, oh, we made the play and we got close to a postseason, and without a monumental collapse, we might have made it. If then Scotty will come back better in a year, we can re-sign our guys. Like, I don't know exactly how much they're going to look to do it, but they totally should go towards a rebuild, in my opinion.
Go ahead. Okay. Nah, I want to hear your thoughts, man. Take the floor.
I agree with you. I think a rebuild is the way to go. And this is what I tweeted out the other week. I said, this is probably the ideal scenario for the Raptors this offseason. You sign and trade Freddie, and Gary probably walks because he's going to have interest. And if you're going towards a rebuild, you probably don't keep Gary, even though he is one of the younger guys on this team. He probably doesn't quite fit the timeline. The one interesting thing I will say about the Gary Trent situation is part and due to the fact that he came off the bench at the end of the year, and part and due to the fact that he didn't play great to end the year, there is probably a scenario still now where Gary might actually opt into his player option, especially if they start moving off of guys so he can play up his value for next summer. So I don't think it's as much of a given now that he walked compared to a month ago, but we'll see how that remains. But whether he walks, whether he opts in, I don't think you re-sign him to a new deal this summer. And then Poeltl probably re-signs, drafted by the Raptors. Keeping him around isn't going to keep you as some great team. I think keeping him around at center makes sense regardless. But then OG and Siakam are the two big needle movers of this offseason. I think both of those guys should be moved off of. And then maybe you move off of Chris Boucher as well. He's probably a bench piece that some teams could like as anyone that's trying to make a playoff push. And then from there, it's just you have Scotty, you have Achua, you have whatever you get back for OG and Siakam, which you probably won't get some high-tier future star, but you should get a couple of young pieces that at least have relatively solid value that you can build around, whether you get a starter or a borderline star, someone you can develop. So, I mean, we were just talking about the Donovan Mitchell trade this offseason as Colin Sexton being the guy and Laurie sprung out of nowhere. So you never really know for sure until some of these guys get new opportunities what you get back. But those returns plus Scotty Barnes, like you said, Gabe, is enough that you probably don't have to be terrible for 4 or 5 years. You can probably be back in the mix within 2 to 3 years, which gives you enough time to have a couple of bad years in terms of draft selections to bring in some pretty good players. And the other thing to note here with the potential rebuild is, of course, some Raptors fans are concerned with the fact that we've now traded away our 2024 first-round pick, but also have contingencies on that for 2025 and 2026, which means the Raptors are really limited in what first-round picks they can trade away, which leads the best direction to be a rebuild because they don't really have the assets for a star trade this offseason because they can't trade the firsts. But secondly, if the Raptors are bad enough next year, that first-round pick is top 6 protected, and you are still going to have a really high selection anyways. So there's still an avenue where the Raptors can rebuild, and it's not for nothing because they don't have their own pick. So there's a little bit more flexibility there than I think some people might realize. Unfortunately, this plan probably means nothing. All odds are, as far as we know, with how Masai Ujiri typically runs any franchise, and especially since he's been with the Raptors, he's going to try and remain competitive. And that's probably not going to involve a star trade because they don't have the flexibility that they had last offseason, like they could have with the Scotty Barnes and a bunch of first-round picks type trade for KD. I just don't think that exists. And the Raptors have never been a free agency destination, nor are they going to have the cap space to make that type of signing. So I'd imagine it's just going to be a lot of the same again. Freddie probably comes back. Gary probably walks. Poeltl probably resigns. Siakam and OG probably stick around, and you just try and make a few moves around the fringes, which are going to be limited. And it's probably going to be more of the same in Toronto. Now, the only significant change might be Nick Nurse. It seems like there could be a mutual termination in the works over the next couple of weeks. All signs seem to be indicating to that, other than whatever comments we get from Ujiri if that changes in the next couple of weeks. But they should rebuild. I just don't think much is going to change in Toronto. I don't think Ujiri's the type of GM that wants to undertake a complete rebuild. I think he still believes enough in this group. And unfortunately, I think that just means Toronto are going to be doing more of the same next year, just maybe slightly better because they have Poeltl, but that's probably about it.
Yeah, that's the one thing that does worry me is just like Masai just seems like, he has a little too much pride to like really embrace a rebuild and has that delusion to where they think that they can stay somewhat competitive, which at this point, like when you look at the timelines of all the guys that are there, it would just make the most sense to just go ahead and hit the reset button, especially when you mention like the 2024 pick being top 6 protected. That would really incline, at least me as a fan, I would want to be as bad as possible so we could keep that pick. It would just make the most sense. And then you could really hit the rebuild with Scotty and whatever young pieces you get back in whatever trades for, Pascal. Maybe to get something back in the signing trade. Probably not something super valuable, but get something back for Freddie. And, getting that, top 6 pick if you are that bad, next season. I just feel like that would make the most sense to me. But I could just, like you said, I could just see Masai just having that thought like, we can just sign like a couple vets, bring some guys back, let Gary walk, and we'll still be somewhat okay. Like we'll have a chance to make the play and to make the playoffs. But that's just not good enough, man. I mean, you're just going to get yourself stuck into that. Just a place in basketball in the NBA where you don't want to be, where you have a bunch of guys on different timelines with no clear direction, and you're not good enough to win a championship or compete for a championship, but you're not bad enough to really, tank and get a top, 5 pick or whatever, top 3 pick. So you're just in that kind of purgatory range. I'm not saying they're there yet. I'm not stealing Gabe's word, but you could be pushing towards that if you don't start to make some clear moves to pick a direction soon. So that worries me, just seeing this from an outside perspective. But I do hope that Masai makes the right choices and is, very, transparent and is like, okay, we're probably not going to get much better with what we have, even if we bring most of these guys back and make a couple of moves. We're probably not going to get that much better, especially with the way the rest of the Eastern Conference looks. And just go ahead and embrace the rebuild, man. There's nothing wrong with a little rebuild. And like you guys both mentioned, they would put themselves in a position to where it won't be like a real like drought like how it was, back in like the mid 2000s, when, the Raptors will continuously out the playoffs. This will be more like maybe a couple, 2-3 years being, kind of bad. But then maybe by that 3rd or 4th year, we'll start to see those signs of becoming, back to being a good team again, as long as Scotty develops or whatever other young talent you bring in develops, So I feel like that would be the smart thing to do. But we'll just have to wait and see because I feel like with the Raptors, especially the last 2 or 3 years, it's all been just smoke and mirrors with, OG rumors, whatever Pascal rumors come out, Freddie and stuff like that. So we'll really just have to wait and see if anything does happen. But like you said, Devin, I would not bank on, any major changes happening, even though it seems like that's the right way to go.
Yeah, I just think there's so many lines of thinking with the direction they end up going. But I feel like it could also make them stuck because you take that line of thinking of like, oh, a new coach could maybe make them better. And theoretically, yes, it could. I think if you bring in a more offensive-minded guy, the defense, I think they have the talent to have a solid defense regardless, especially as Nurse was more of a defensive-minded coach. It's not like they're losing that experience. And at the same time, it's just, Scotty can defend, OG can defend, Poeltl can defend. You just have guys that can do that. However, it's still not going to be good enough to put you over the top. And so you still would just end up stuck at like maybe a 6th, 5th seed if you're lucky and not even cracking that top 4 and just being a first round out. And so for a guy like me, especially as a fan, it's just like, if you're not first, you're last. If you're not contending for a title, what's the point? If you're not contending, you need to be getting better. You need to be young and ascending. You don't want to be not contending, but just where you are. And the problem is, if you move forward and just say, oh, we'll get a different coach, well, because so many guys' contracts are up now, if you run it back with the same roster, you think these guys are taking 1-year deals? I don't think these guys are taking 1-year deals. So if you don't let some of them walk now, either you're going to be trying to find your way into a million trades and probably have not much leverage because everybody knows things are going downhill. And so you just have like year 1 of a coach and all your guys are under contract for like 3 years. And it's like, oh, it's still not working that well. They're just stuck there. And then you just have like 2-3 more years of being whatever. And I don't think anybody wants that.
Yeah,
so you got to go for the rebuild.
Another team that said, a new coach will just kind of fix things. The Portland Trailblazers, they said the same thing. They're like, all right, Terry Stotts, you've been here for like, almost a decade, but we'll just bring in Chauncey Billups and things will change. Things didn't change. Like, it's pretty much the same story, maybe worse, because the roster wasn't even as good. So, a new coach does not fix everything. A new coach might fix things if you're like how the Raptors were, the post, after trading DeMar, it's like, okay, yeah, we got in Kawhi, but maybe we do need a new coach to, just kind of speak to these guys, bring in a new philosophy. That's when like having a new coach with a bunch of veteran players makes sense. But this is a team that is kind of stuck in that no man's land where it's like, yeah, last season you guys were 5th seed, but I think a lot of people can maybe agree a little bit of overachievement, like in that sense. I mean, the Nets had kind of like a turmoil-filled season where, Kyrie missed half of it due to the COVID stuff. Harden got traded at the deadline, so they were like a 7th seed, and that was crazy. And the Cavs really fell off, and then the Raptors were just solid enough to push themselves up to a 5th seed. So it's like, even though you guys were 5th seed last season, it's not like you guys were like a juggernaut 5th seed, by any sense of the mean. So, it would just make more sense to pick that direction and, just hit the rebuild button, man. It just makes the most logical basketball sense to me.
Definitely makes the most sense, but they're definitely in danger here of being in the next Pacers in the East. They might just hang around the plane for the next few years, but hopefully at least a type of move gets made this offseason. And I don't think there'll be a full commitment of any direction either way, but even if they just start to get there, that would be positive if an OG gets moved off of or something of the sorts, because of course him and Siakam will be extension eligible this summer. So we'll see how that plays out. But the only thing that I think a new coach could help a little bit with in Toronto, and even still, like you guys said, it's not going to change things drastically, but Nurse is a great defensive mind and a great defensive coach. The problem is the way he has this Raptors defense playing, he plays them like a team that he can run 9 deep and he can use his bench frequently because it's such a high intensity and frantic style of defense. Yet he plays his starters 38 to 40 at night. And it just doesn't work. The guys get burnt out. And you saw it, especially with Siakam this year, you really saw it like for stretches of the second half of the year. Defense was not as good. Mid-ranger was just flat, didn't look as good. Like, they were just visibly tired. That's the one thing I think that could be improved by a new head coach, but I mean, it's not going to be enough for it to matter. Ultimately, unless this Raptors team gets depth or shooting, they're still just not going to be that great. And even if they do get depth or shooting, again, like you guys mentioned, they're probably a 5 or a 6 seed at best. So with Scotty in there, still young enough at the time that he can still fit the timeline, it makes sense to pick a direction now. And like you say, Gabe, not to give these guys some new contracts and then move off them in 2 or 3 years and then get the Scotties in like year 5, year 6, and then you're probably having to move off of him as part of this rebuild as well, which would be a real shame. So hopefully the decision gets made before it screws up the timeline with Scotty, so you don't miss out on the one time you actually got a top 4 pick throughout this run of not great but not bad years.
Exactly. I wish I had some trade articles, but I couldn't find any, that I trusted. So, we'll just have to save that for the offseason, man. Hopefully we'll have some trades to talk about with the Toronto Raptors.
Yeah.
We thought we would at the deadline, but like Gabe said, it was more like them buying into trying to make the playoffs instead of, flaunting with a little rebuild or retool idea.
Yeah, I saw that mock trade that one of you guys sent earlier. I think it was Devin. Just with the Celtics get Pascal, like the Rockets get JB, and then the Raptors just get a bunch of assets. And I'm like, hey, you can draw that up and make it work as much as you want. It's not happening.